The Game Boy Color is one of Nintendo's most interesting consoles because technically it actually has two different game libraries. We have these cartridges which are compatible with both the Game Boy Color and the original Game Boy, and then we also have the see-through games which are only compatible with the Game Boy Color and took advantage of the extra hardware. So what I've decided to do is focus exclusively on these cross-compatible games, and then in a future video I'll do another Top Games video where I cover the Game Boy Color exclusive games. So with that said, let's get started with game number 20, and that is Game & Watch Gallery 3. So the Game & Watch Gallery series is a collection of Game & Watch games which also have modern equivalents, and they're all so much fun to play. For those of you that don't know, the Game & Watch was Nintendo's first ever handheld console, or a series of different consoles that had a bunch of different games, and Nintendo revisited that library with the Game Boy and came out with a few compilations. And I chose the third one here because it has my favourite Game & Watch game, which is Donkey Kong Jr. This was actually the Game & Watch that I had as a kid, and unfortunately the screen snapped, but I could always play the Game Boy Color version. And I love the modern remakes of the original Game & Watch games too. They replaced all of the little black and white cartoony graphics with actual Mario characters, and it's so much fun to see how they took those original concepts and translated them into Nintendo specific games. And because the games originated on the Game & Watch, they're all incredibly simple, but that also means they're incredibly easy to get into, and it's so much fun to try and beat your high scores and to give the Game Boy to friends and family to see whether they can beat you too. The Game & Watch Gallery series has always been one of my favourites, and I definitely recommend checking out the Game Boy Color entries. Number 19 here is a really interesting RPG by Capcom. It's called Metal Walker, and I was actually expecting a Pokémon clone. And while it may look like a Pokémon clone at first glance, the minute you enter a battle, that notion is completely thrown out the window, and this is actually a completely original game concept. The overworld sections play a lot like Pokémon, and you can capture the robots, but the whole way the game plays is very strange, and it's a very unusual take on the JRPG battle system. So it actually plays more similarly to something like pool or billiards, where you're actually bouncing around in this top-down view of the battle arena, and you have different things that you can throw onto the level and different ways of capturing the enemies, or you roll over certain blocks in order to do different attacks. It's very unusual, but it is actually very enjoyable as well. At first I was completely thrown off because I was just expecting a basic turn-based battle system, but once I got the hang of it, I actually really began to enjoy myself with this. And it's got a really interesting story. It's actually quite a well-told story for the Game Boy Color. There was a great intro cutscene that sets up the world building and the reason for you going out and exploring this wasteland basically and rebuilding these robots. It's really cool, and it's completely unlike anything else that I've played on any system really. So if you want a completely fresh JRPG experience, highly recommend checking out Metal Walker. Now for this next one, I feel like the comments section would just go berserk if I didn't include it, so it had to make the list at some point. This is of course Tetris DX. It's nothing more really than a simple colour-enhanced version of the original Tetris for the original Game Boy, but because of the status of the original Game Boy Tetris being just one of the most popular games of all time, one of the best and most well-designed puzzle games of all time, it was a very welcome addition to the early Game Boy Color library, and this was the game that they used along with Wario Land 2, which of course I will cover a bit later on. This is the game that they used to actually sell the system, and as soon as you boot it up you can really tell that they just went wild with all of the colour possibilities. It's not just the bricks that are coloured in, also the backgrounds are all different colours and they're all moving around on the screen, and they were really showing off what the Game Boy Color could do. And of course it is just typical Game Boy Tetris. Apart from that, there's none of the modern amenities that make Tetris kind of difficult to go back to these days. But if you enjoy that very simple Tetris experience with no sort of sliding the pieces around or the hold or the hard drop, then you can definitely enjoy this. And if you do want some of those modern enhancements, then modders and ROM hackers have taken it upon themselves to create some upgraded versions of Tetris DX as well, which are definitely worth checking out, and I have done some videos on them in the past as well. well. So there really is nothing more I can say about Tetris DX other than it is a puzzle masterpiece, and the Game Boy Color version is just as good as any other. But what about if you've already played Tetris a million times and you want a little bit of a different puzzle game? Well, this is where the next entry comes in, and yeah, you're going to be quite surprised that I chose to put this one above Tetris. But recently, I've actually been enjoying this a lot more, and it is Hello Kitty Cube Frenzy. And I know you weren't expecting this one, but let me explain. So actually my favourite version of Tetris is Tetris Plus because of the puzzle mode where you control the professor and you move him around the environment and you actually use the blocks to build the platforms in order to escape. So I was looking for more games like that, and to my surprise, Hello Kitty on the Game Boy Color is exactly the game I was looking for. So basically it's Tetris insofar as the blocks fall down from the top of the screen, but what you need to do is actually maneuver Hello Kitty herself within these levels using the blocks to actually navigate the environment to collect all the items in the stage in order to move on to the next one. And of course there's a bunch of different obstacles in the levels as well. There's enemies that kick the blocks around, and also you have to worry about the fact that the blocks have a little bit of gravity as well, so you can kind of use it to your advantage to build different staircases and things. It's a really unique concept. It's a little bit different to how it works in Tetris Plus, but it was honestly for me one of the best surprises that I've had all year when I found out about this game, and I need you guys to check it out. It is so much fun. Next is Blaster Master Enemy Below, and a lot of people see this game and think that it is just a port of the NES original, but it's actually a very different, and in my opinion, a much better game than that one. For one thing, and this is probably because it's on the Game Boy, but the scale of the game is much reduced, and I actually think that makes for a much more enjoyable experience. It's a lot easier to find your way around, and I felt like I was just wandering around for hours in the NES original, just completely lost, whereas in this one I can easily, within an hour, get to the first boss and go through all of the different dungeons that I need to in order to get there and find some good upgrades. So from a beginner's point of view, it's a lot easier to get into, but also once you get more invested in the game, it is just so good. The atmosphere is fantastic. It kind of feels like a Metroid game on steroids for me personally. I actually much prefer Blaster Master Enemy Below than I do Metroid 2 in terms of Game Boy Metroid style adventures. And the interesting thing about Blaster Master is that it's technically 3 different styles of gameplay in one. So you have the regular side-scrolling tank sections where you're moving the tank Sophia around and you can aim with your sort of blaster cannon and shoot up or sideways, and then you can press select to get outside of the tank and do a few platforming sort of challenge areas as the main character as well. And then you also get the top-down sections which play kind of similar to something like Crystallis, which was also on the NES and the Game Boy Color, which I'll be showing in the next video. I've got that one right here. So it's kind of a mix of 3 different genres of game, and it pulls it off incredibly well. And I will say, on the topic of Blaster Master, definitely check out the new games in the series too by Inti Creates. These are some of my favourite 2D games of the past decade, and it's so interesting to play this game and then go back and play the originals and see how Inti took their inspiration and just built upon them. And it really is not as hard as you would think to go back and play these originals, especially the Game Boy Color ones, so definitely check it out. Bomberman Tournament here for the Game Boy Advance is one of my favourite action RPGs, so I was very pleasantly surprised when I found out that there was actually a Bomberman RPG for the Game Boy Color as well. This is called Bomberman Quest, and it's basically Bomberman's answer to The Legend of Zelda. It has the same top-down structure, it even has dungeons just like a Zelda game, complete with their own puzzles and unlockable treasure chests and the same sort of progression, but there are a few interesting things that separate this from the traditional Zelda formula, and that comes from the items that you find when you kill the enemies on different screens. And first of all, just finding the enemies on the screens is quite interesting as well, because each time you encounter one, you get a little bit of back and forth dialogue, which I always thought was really fun, and they have some very interesting things to say as well. But when you defeat the enemy, you actually get a power-up from that enemy, and some of them you can take back to the shop at the beginning of the game and use that to retool your bombs. You can change your bomb types, you can use it to upgrade your speed and your weapons and everything like that. So it's a really interesting take on the Bomberman formula. It still feels like a classic Bomberman game, but it also at the same time feels like a top-down Zelda game as well. I would say personally that I don't enjoy it as much as Bomberman Tournament or some of the later Bomberman adventure games, but if you're curious where those sort of RPG Bomberman games got their start, definitely check out Bomberman Quest. So this is the other one of those launch titles that I was talking about. This is Wario Land 2. Not Wario Land 2 DX like Zelda, but this is basically the DX version of the original Game Boy Wario Land game. And this one, just like Zelda, was kind of a showcase of what was possible with the Game Boy Color. And Nintendo did a great job taking the original Game Boy game and upgrading it for color. As a kid, this was definitely my favourite game on the system. I would always play it every single day after school, and I just loved finding all of the different treasure pieces and trying to fill out that treasure map that you get. So at the end of each stage you have to try and guess what this number is, and then you can win a treasure piece, and I just loved going back to all the levels to try and 100% that grid. And there's so many little hidden secrets and different experimental paths that you can take, and the way that you use all of the different transformations as Wario to get to some of these different areas is really unique, and it's really fun, and it's still very original even today. There aren't really any other games that have taken that kind of transformation gameplay, because obviously in the Wario Land games you can't die, so actually being attacked by some of the enemies does weird things to you. So there's, for example, in this game, there's things that crush you, and then you can become a really flat version of Wario that when you jump in the air you sort of glide very slowly down like a leaf in the wind. And it's just a really unique concept, and they pulled it off incredibly well. And of course all of the other Wario Land games are great, and I'm sure I'll bring up the third game in the second part of these Game Boy Color games videos. Next is the Konami Collection. I've got volume 2 here, and there are actually 4 different ones, each with 4 different games included. This is the one that I had as a kid, so this is the one that I've chosen to show off in this top games video, but they're all worth checking out for various different reasons. They kind of all seem to have one highlight game, and then 2 or 3 mixed opinions games, and then one just throwaway dud. So in this case, Parodius is definitely the game that sells this collection. Parodius, for those of you that don't know, is an incredible horizontal scrolling shoot 'em up, and it's basically a parody of Gradius, and there's loads of really cool things about it. As well, in this game we also have Frogger, which was Konami's very famous arcade game, and that plays fantastic on here. And then the throwaway games on here, kind of block game, which is just a really boring game. I never understood the appeal of this one. You just throw the blocks up at the screen and you make squares, and that's literally it. And the other game that's on this collection is Track and Field, which I loved playing on the NES, but it doesn't really have the same appeal on the Game Boy. But really, the reason I'm recommending this is Parodius. Not only is it a fantastic conversion to the Game Boy, and again, this did come out on the original Game Boy too, but they did a great job actually colorizing all of the games for these collections as well. And it's really interesting to see some of those color choices among the various different Konami collections that are available on the system. So if you get the chance, definitely check out the full range of the Konami Collection games for the Game Boy Color, because they're all great in their own right, and you might just find a new favourite Konami game while playing through them. Now for another JRPG that also kind of threw me off a little bit. This is Azure Dreams, and again, I was expecting a Pokemon style game, and although yes, again, it does include capturing monsters and using them to fight, this actually feels a lot more similar to the Pokemon Mystery Dungeon games than the main Pokemon games. It's got a really cool premise where you basically have to scale this giant tower in search of your father, and the gameplay loop goes that you get as far as you can in the tower, and then you go back to the town to basically power up your monsters that you've collected and get new items and upgrades, and then go back into the tower and try and progress a little bit further and further each time. It's got a really interesting kind of random generated layout as well, so every time you go back in there it's going to be a fresh experience. There's tons of different items to find and collect as you're going through, and of course there's a bunch of different monsters to find as well. And there's also a great amount of things to do in the town too, so you're never really bored whether you're in the tower or you're in the town talking to the NPCs and doing various things there as well. I know there's also a version of this on the PlayStation 1 which I've never actually played, but I'm really curious to see how it stacks up against the Game Boy Color game, because I presume that this one is downscaled to manage to fit onto the Game Boy Color, but it really does feel like a full-featured game on its own as well. So if you like those sort of dungeon crawler, random generated monster catching kind of games, highly recommend Azure Dreams. Next we have another Bomberman game, and this one's actually a very different game. This one's actually a platforming puzzle game in the Bomberman series, and it's called Pocket Bomberman. And it's definitely my favourite single screen puzzle platformer on the Game Boy Color. It kind of reminds me of the Donkey Kong game on the original Game Boy, but with a lot more explosions, obviously, with it being a Bomberman game. And it's kind of got an interesting perspective to it. So it's a side-on game, but when you plant the bomb, it stays in place and it explodes just like you would expect from a regular Bomberman game. So it takes a little bit of time to get used to the weird sort of top-down but also side-on approach that this game takes. But once you get your head around it, it is a really fun game, and there's some great level layouts, and of course in typical Bomberman fashion as well, you can also pick up a variety of items to help you increase your power, either your bomb's firepower or the ability to kick the bombs or just to run faster, general things like that which make it easier and easier to play the further into the game you get as well. It's definitely one of those games that I love to go back to and play over and over again, and if you enjoyed those sort of puzzle platforming games, there really is no better option on the Game Boy Color than Pocket Bomberman, so definitely check it out. And now we're down to the top 10 and starting off very strong here with Dragon Warrior 1 and 2. And this game, unlike Blaster Master, is actually a port of the first two games, and when I first played this as a kid, I was so excited to be able to take what was one of the first games that I ever played on the go with me. And I remember back when this house here used to belong to my nan and granddad, I actually would sleep over here, and I would sleep in this room right there when I was like 5 years old, and I would have my Game Boy Color with a copy of Dragon Warrior 1 and 2, and I would be sitting there with a little nightlight next to me trying to angle the screen at the correct angle to play through this game. And it really is a fantastic port, and every time I play it, it brings back so many fantastic memories for me as well as some of the other Dragon Warrior games, which we'll be covering a little bit later on in this video. But that is such a nice memory, and it's really great to revisit this game for this video as well, and it just reminded me why I fell in love with this series back then. Now, NES ports are cool and all, but it's not really pushing the system to its limits. But what about a Super Nintendo game that got scaled down onto the Game Boy Color? And that is exactly what this next game is. This is Man Xtreme, and honestly, this is genuinely impressive. It's basically a Game Boy Color version of the original Mega Man X, complete with 8-bit renditions of the music and all of the stages and the boss fights. Everything's here, just downscaled into 8-bit. Like, if there was a NES version of Mega Man X, this is what it would be like. It is an incredible accomplishment from Capcom to pull this off, and for it to feel as fluid as it does as well. It basically is Mega Man X for the Game Boy. It has all of the features that you would expect. It has the wall jump and the slide, and it has the dash mechanic, and it's just fantastic. And it really is just so impressive to see what they managed to pull off on the Game Boy Color. Obviously it does have some shortcomings, and it's obviously not the version you would choose to replay if you had the choice. Obviously the Super Nintendo version is far superior in every regard, but if you want to play a portable version of Mega Man X, before the PSP came out anyway, let's ignore that one for now, it really was the best you could get on a handheld at the time, and it's great to play an action game for the Game Boy that doesn't feel slowed down either. I remember in my Game Boy Top 20 that I did last year, I think, I was kind of complaining that a lot of the action games were slowed down because of the screen and the refresh rate and stuff, whereas this one on the Game Boy Color feels like it plays at the same speed as the SNES game, which is just fantastic. So yeah, I'm sure you can tell I am very impressed by this game, and it is a great entry in the Mega Man series. Next is a game series by Natsume that I'm sure a lot of people watching really enjoy, and that is the Harvest Moon games. There was 2 Harvest Moon games released that were dual compatible with the Game Boy and the Game Boy Color, and Harvest Moon 2 improved a lot from the first game. It introduced a whole town aspect as well, which I loved walking around, talking to all of the different people who run the shops and getting to know the villagers, and I love these portraits on the Game Boy Color as well. It really is one of my favourite things to see on the Game Boy Color screen, is the portraits in Harvest Moon. I just think they look so cool. But the game itself is obviously just a very laid-back farming simulator. There's no real stress involved in this game. It doesn't have the dungeons of something like Rune Factory, which I think would have been really cool to add into this series, but it is very much focused just around trying to get more money, get more animals, make your farm look a little bit nicer, get to know the villagers, of course end up getting married, which is of course from Harvest Moon 2 onwards one of the big things in the series. It really did do everything right for the Game Boy though, and it just feels like such a cozy place that you could really make your own. And before things like Animal Crossing on the DS, this was pretty much the closest you could get to that kind of lifestyle sort of sim for the system. And Natsume really pulled it off on the Game Boy Color, and that also applies to their next game as well, which we're going to go straight into, which was The Legend of the River King. And again, just like Harvest Moon, there was actually two that came out dual compatible. And again, the sequel improved a lot from the first game. The first one feels kind of slow and clunky, but the second game definitely smoothed things out a lot. And interestingly, you can actually link between the two of them as well, so if you get certain items in Harvest Moon, you can actually send them over to Legend of the River King and vice versa. So if you're building out both of these games at the same time, and you've got two systems and a link cable, it's really a great way to enjoy both styles of games. So you've got the farming aspects of Harvest Moon, and you've also got a lot more than just fishing. You would expect the Legend of the River King games to be all about fishing, but there's also bug catching, there's kind of light farming elements where you collect different flowers, and there's also a lot of things around the basic fishing simulation aspect of the game as well. There's a bunch of different upgrades you can get to your rod and different bait, and again, kind of like Harvest Moon, you're just sort of doing the same gameplay loop over and over again to progress and get bigger and bigger fish and to upgrade your house and everything like that. And both of these games put together definitely make two of the most relaxing games on the system, and if you want to play a game where you can just get lost in it for hours and hours and really make it your own, that is what Natsume was so good at back then, and they really pulled it off with both of these games, and they are two of the best games in their respective genres too. But as fun as those simulation games by Natsume are, there is one game on the Game Boy Color that did it better. This is a simulation game by Konami, and it is Stranded Kids, also known in America as Survival Kids. And I'm a massive fan of the DS game Lost in Blue, so when I found out that there was a prequel to it on the Game Boy Color, I knew one day I had to track it down, and it was a very expensive game, and it took me a long time to be able to get my hands on it, and I'm so happy that I finally have it complete in box, and I actually played it on stream just after I got the game earlier this year, and I was just blown away. In some ways, I think it's even better than Lost in Blue. It really was just an incredibly well-made game for the time. It even has crafting mechanics, which is obviously a staple of modern-day survival games, but to see that sort of gameplay system being implemented on the Game Boy Color like 20 years before it even became commonplace on PC and console, is just an incredible game from start to finish. You really feel the isolation of being stranded on this island, and you really feel the desperation as well, always having to worry about your hunger and your thirst, and even progressing in the game and actually trying to find a way off the island as well. It really is Lost in Blue distilled into the perfect formula, and to see it running on the Game Boy Color and to see all of the different options and all of the many different endings that this game has as well, it really is a sight to behold, and I honestly think it was worth the insane price that I paid to get this complete in box, because it is really a one-of-a-kind game for the system, and definitely give it a try if you haven't already. I really think you'll be pleasantly surprised, just like I was. Next is another Dragon Warrior game, and another one that I played as a kid, and at the time I actually enjoyed this more than Pokémon, which is crazy to think these days. That was Dragon Warrior Monsters, and I've been back and played it since then, and I can see that the first game in the Dragon Warrior Monsters series at least was actually a very simple game. When I was playing it to capture footage for this video, it actually reminded me a bit more of Azure Dreams than it did Pokémon. The idea that you've got this sort of hub area to start out with and to build up your team, and then you go into these smaller sort of dungeon sections, which are just kind of like random graphics thrown together and a few items dotted around and monsters to fight. And the big thing about this game is that you're collecting the monsters, you're fighting them, and then you're building up your monsters to be able to fight in these tournaments. It's a great gameplay loop, but it is very simple, especially compared to some of the games that came after, which is what I'm moving on to right now, which is Dragon Warrior Monsters 2. And just like Pokemon, there was 2 different versions of this game. This one is Tara's Adventure, and there's also another version, and you could obviously link the 2 together. This one is a massive improvement over the first Dragon Warrior Monsters game. For one thing, it has more of an overarching story now, rather than just fighting your way into this tournament. And the dungeon areas actually have their own stories as well, complete with towns and NPCs and sort of integrated stories into those different areas. And then as well as that, you also have your farm and the overworld that you go back to, just like the first game. And using this farm, that's where you can create the new monsters, you can breed to get different combinations of monsters and then go back using the keys into this magic mirror. And it's just a great gameplay loop, just like the first game. And I love everything about both of these games. The battle system is fantastic. The graphics and the sound effects are so nostalgic. I love all of the different effects, like when you go into the different worlds and it's all sort of wavy and you have this really cool sound effect playing. And of course it features all of the classic Dragon Quest and Dragon Warrior monsters that you've come to know and love. And it's great to be able to train them up and give them names and kind of get to know the monsters a bit better as well. And I love the farm that you can go and explore. They are 2 fantastic games. I've never actually played any of the more recent games in the Dragon Quest Monsters series, so let me know down in the comments below whether you would recommend that I check out the newest one that came out on the Switch recently. And of course, you all knew it was coming at some point. Here's a Pokemon game, but maybe not the one you were thinking. This is Pokemon Trading Card Game. And this is fantastic. More than any other game on the Game Boy Color, this is the game that I go back to if I just want a quick session of something to play. It really is perfect. They just nailed the rule set and the essence of the trading card game and pulled it off spectacularly. I love the fact that you get the different booster packs and you can use that to make your own deck stronger. And I also love the very, very simplified RPG sections of this as well. Basically, you have a world map and you can choose one of the different gyms to go to, and you kind of get a little bit of space to walk around, but mostly it's just to find people in order to do the card battles. And thankfully, the card battles themselves are an absolute highlight, and the music as soon as you start the fights is just iconic, and the way the fights play out is really great too. I love all the little visual flourishes, like the coin that flips in the air, and it just makes perfect sense. And I really wish they'd carried on the trading card games series as a side series to the main games. Just imagine what they could have done on the DS with this style of game, with your actual deck of cards on the touchscreen. I just think it would have been fantastic. But what is here is good in itself, and it really has held up to the test of time very well. Obviously, it only features the original Pokemon. There was actually an expanded version that came out in Japan, which has an English translation with a few extra packs, but basically it's exactly the same game as this one, so you're not really missing out on that much. And it really is fun to go back to, and even today, like I said, it holds up extremely well. So if you enjoy the Pokemon trading card game, there really is no reason not to give this one a go. Of course, no top Nintendo games list is complete without a Zelda title, and of course this one was coming. This is The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening DX. Again, just like some of the earlier games that I've mentioned in this video, this was one that took the original black and white game and gave it some extra colour. But as well as that, this one also introduced a brand new colour dungeon as well, which takes advantage of the new colour display. And it's a fantastic Zelda game. In fact, a lot of people say that this is the best 2D Zelda game. I wouldn't quite say it's the best, but it's definitely in the top 3, maybe, so definitely check it out if you've never played it before. Obviously, it had a great remake on the Switch, but that doesn't stop the original being just as fun as it was back then. This was another one that I had as a kid as well, and I remember I actually took it to school one day when we were allowed to take in our own toys and things from home, and I sat at the back of the class playing Zelda Link's Awakening DX on my Game Boy Color for the entire day, just ignoring everything else that was going on around me because I was so engrossed in this game. And then I also remember that I came home that day and I had a video camera, a black and white video camera, so obviously you couldn't see the colour, but I was actually showing it off on the camera, and that was actually one of the very first gaming related videos that I ever made. So that is just such a great story, and this game kind of ties into how you're actually seeing me here today on YouTube. So it is thanks to this game partially that I'm actually here sharing this list with you all now. And of course you all saw this coming, and I'll throw them both in because they're basically the same game. Pokemon Pokemon Gold and Pokemon Silver. There really is no better game for the system, and in my opinion, there really is no better Pokemon game either. These were just incredible at the time, and I was the perfect age to hit that Pokemon fever in the late 90s and the early 2000s, so as soon as these came out, they were the only thing that I played for that entire year. I just remember being completely enamored by these games. There really was nothing else on this scale on the Game Boy, and I really don't think there is anything that even comes close to Gold and Silver in terms of scale. Not only does it have a completely brand new region to explore and a whole bunch of new Pokemon to find as well, but then you can also go back and revisit all of your favourite locations from the first Pokemon game as well, and this is the only Pokemon game that's actually done that, and I was really sad that Ruby and Sapphire didn't let you revisit Johto, because I really thought that that was something they would keep doing throughout the rest of the series. But even so, the Johto games are just absolutely phenomenal from start to finish. They have my favourite story in Pokemon, they have some of my favourite areas, the atmosphere is just incredible, the battle system, of course, being Pokemon, is just second to none. The music is just incredible as well, it's easily one of my favourite game soundtracks of all time. The new Pokemon were fantastic. There literally is not a single thing that I can fault about these games, and even if you don't play Pokemon, please give it a chance and you will see what all the fuss is about, and I really do think that they hold up incredibly well today as well. And I know maybe I'm saying this with slightly rose-tinted glasses, but the newer games in the series, they really don't hold a candle to the originals. There really is something about these. Maybe it's the fact that they're slightly more challenging than some of the newer games, or it's the stripped back gameplay that makes it just a little bit more immediate to play. You don't have to sit through like 20 minutes of cutscenes when you get to a new area. It really does feel great to play them today, and I really think that even if you haven't played them before, you will have just as good as an experience as I did when I was a kid if you give them a chance today. So definitely give Gold and Silver a go if you haven't already, and if you have, then I'm sure you can tell why I put them as number one. So that was my top 20 games for the Game Boy Color. Thank you all so much for watching. Check out my original Game Boy Top 20 here, and when it's released, check out my Top 20 Game Boy Color exclusives video on that side, and I'll see you all again very soon. Goodbye.